Hello and welcome to the Drexel Interview. I'm your host, Paula Morantz-Cohen, speaking to you from the Drexel University Picture Gallery. Today, I'm extremely pleased to welcome as my guest the exceptional writer, screenwriter, and director, Nora Ephron. Nora Ephron has been nominated 3 times for an Academy Award for Original Screenplay and has not only written but produced and directed such already classic romantic comedies as Sleepless in Seattle, You've Got Mail, and Julie and Juliet. She is also a delightful essayist, and her most recent collection is entitled I Remember Nothing and Other Reflections. This is the first part of a 2-part interview. In the first part, we'll talk about Nora Ephron's life and printed work, and in the second half, we'll discuss her movies. Nora Ephron, welcome to the Drexel Interview.
Thank you.
I am such an admirer of your work. It's, I guess, almost 30 years since I discovered you. I read Heartburn, and I'm going to talk about that book later. I just wanted to start with that.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay.
But I want to start by asking you about your formative years, your childhood. You grew up the daughter of Phoebe and Henry. Ephron, and you have 3 sisters. So it's an exceptional family. I think of it, having read about it, as something like a Jewish version of the Van Dorens, but funny. So was your family like that? Was there great wit around the dinner table?
Who knows? But it was, you know, it was a dinner table, and we had dinner 5 nights a week, at least, and you were expected to be entertaining about what had happened to you that day, or else we all talked about things my parents wanted to talk about, like why we should be in love with President Roosevelt, who was no longer president, you understand, but we were being educated in, you know, a lifelong love of the Democratic Party and the New Deal and all the things that we were assured had saved the country. And I think we all became writers at that table. There are 4 daughters who were all writers, and I've said this a million times. My mother always said to us, everything is copy, everything is a story. Someday you will think this is a funny story. If you went to my mother with a sad story, she was looking forward to your turning it into a funny story. The sooner the better. She wasn't really interested if it was a sad story. And I think that they basically taught us, well, first of all, how to tell a story, and second of all, a very fundamental lesson of humor, which is that if something terrible happens, you know, if you slip on a banana peel, people laugh at you. But if you tell people you slipped on a banana peel, it's your joke, and you're the heroine of it. And that's very much in the tradition of a certain kind of humor, the perfect squelch, the, you know, telling. I remember years and years later going to see Woody Allen when he was very, very young and a stand-up comic, and he got up in some boîte in New York and did 20 minutes on how he had been rejected by one woman after another, after another, after another. And at the end of it, everyone in the room wanted to go home with him. All the women did, because he was so funny about it. You know, he owned his rejections and became, you know, wildly attractive on account of it. And I think my parents were trying to teach us how to do that. So
it was both about humor, and it was also about a certain kind of resilience.
Totally, yes. And I think even though, having had children, I'm a little puzzled by it as a way of dealing with things. Because, you know, here's what my mother never said if you told her that something bad had happened to you. She never said, oh, I'm so sorry.
Do you say that? Do you say,
oh? Of course you do.
I know, and they expect it.
It's entirely counterintuitive not to say it.
Right.
I mean, this person you love as much as anything on the planet comes to you with something that's happened. You're going to put your arms around them. You're going to stroke them. You're going to say, I know exactly how you feel. Not my mother. And so even though you can you can spend quite a lot of money at the shrink discussing why she was that way. In terms of learning how to deal with life's downs, not life's ups, but definitely life's downs, it is not the worst lesson that you can teach a child.
Well, I want you to talk more about your mother, because you write about your mother in your new book.
Yes.
And you say, I mean, you idolized your mother growing up. She was glamorous, she was clever, she was just, I mean, it sounds like she was a very powerful person. And
Totally,
yet,
yes.
you say at a certain
She's
point,
still powerful. I mean,
in your mind.
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
well,
Yeah.
she would have to be. But then you say she became a drunk,
Yes.
whom at a certain point you hardly could regret her death. I mean, you
Yes,
sort of
well,
say that.
I think that it's a very common thing with kids whose parents become alcoholics, because most children's parents become alcoholics at some point. They are not necessarily wild alcoholics when they have children at 26 or 29, but eventually that happens, and I think it's a completely perplexing thing for children of alcoholics to square those two things of the parent you love and idolize and need and all of the rest of it with the parent that you don't know how this happened or what to do about them. And my mother was really frightening when she was drunk. And
when did this start to occur?
it started when I was about 15, and I was the luckiest of the four sisters because I had so many good years with her. I had, you know, by the time you're 15, almost anything can happen and you're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I went off to college and missed, you know, the truly awful part of it. But it was still wildly confusing.
Now, we've already mentioned you are one of four sisters. One more and you would have been in a remake of Pride and Prejudice. 5.
That's true, but not really in any way.
Okay.
No,
But
because we all think of ourselves as Elizabeth. Yes.
I get that sense.
Yes.
Well, that's the question I wanted to ask. It seems to me you're all writers, but there must have been a sense, because I'm from a family, 2 girls, but there's a divvying out. There's a
dividing up of adjectives.
Exactly.
Yes,
And you
exactly.
get, you have certain talents ascribed to you. And I wonder about that. I mean, especially because you decided early on to be a journalist, if that had something to do with the particular kind of labeling or...
No, because everybody, all of us became writers, so I don't think...
But even within writing, was
No.
creativity divvied out at all? Not at all?
Not at all. In fact, I don't think they thought any of us was particularly creative, as I understand the word. That is, but I think they thought we were all going to be writers.
They assumed that?
They wanted it, and it was the magnetic field. And I think it's very hard if both your parents are writers. I think you have to work very hard not to be a writer because you're going to be good at it. And when I decided I was going to become a journalist, to me, that was like saying I was going to go to Vermont and become a cobbler. I thought it was a complete
departure.
Rejection of because I thought of them, I didn't think of them as writers. I thought of them as Hollywood screenwriters. Obviously, I was not going to be a screenwriter. God forbid I would ever be a screenwriter.
Why do you say God forbid?
Because I would have had to live in California. That was in the 50s. You had to live in California to be in the movie business, first of all. And second of all, there were no women in the movie business. The women who were writers, almost all of them wrote with their husbands. My parents and the Canans and the Hacketts and the Frank Ravaches, and it was just a bunch of teams. You know, I didn't want any of that, and I knew that I didn't want to live in L.A. because it was so clear that we were New Yorkers. You know, we were New York people, and we subscribed to the Saturday Review of Literature, and we got the Sunday New York Times, and we had a house full of books, and my friends would come over and they would say, "What do you need all these books for?"
Well, let's talk about this. You were born in New York, and you've thought of yourself, your family thought of themselves as New Yorkers,
Yeah.
I guess sort of New York intellectuals.
No, we
You
knew
wouldn't
we
put it,
weren't intellectuals.
but yet tending in that direction. Ideas were important.
Well, yes.
Talk was important.
And writing was important. Fiction was important. Nonfiction was important. What people
Books
were reading
important.
was important. What my mother did, she wasn't the brownie leader, obviously, but she would get in her little Studebaker, and she would drive all the way to La Cienega Boulevard, which was about 1.5 miles away. That's about as far as she ever went from our house. And there was a bookstore there of secondhand books, and she would buy us these amazing collections of, Spanish fairy tales. She would come back. It was completely thrilling, So books were everything when I was growing up.
Well, then, so New York, then, but you went to school in L.A., and then you went to college in Massachusetts at Wellesley. I
Yes.
just find that what a triangular
No, but it was all on the
sense.
way back to New York.
Oh, so you were
Going
circling
east
back.
to school was just a way of going. It was
Back
on,
to
it
New
was
York?
sort of halfway. It was on.
You
the
don't
way.
think each of these places is part of the constellation of what you are?
Well, yes, in a way, but it's just that I can't tell you how clearly I knew the entire time I was growing up in Los Angeles that I was getting out of there.
Okay, and so you did get out. You got back to New York.
I had, for a while, I had some clothes that were kind of L.A. But,
what are clothes that are kind of LA?
At the time, there were a lot of pink and blue things, pale pink and pale blue.
Oh,
It was
pastel.
very pastel. That isn't true anymore.
The black.
Everyone
New York
in
and
LA,
Paris,
even
black.
in LA,
Yeah.
people don't wear pastels anymore. But when I went to college and everyone was wearing these kind of peck and peck plaid things, I looked completely different. But that was it.
Okay. So you got back to New York after college, and you worked for Newsweek. You write about it in the new book, I Remember Nothing. You talk about this going to Newsweek where no woman could really be a writer.
Right. Well, that was their policy.
That was their policy
Yes.
then, and so you were there.
And they said it out loud. That's what's so amazing
Unbelievable.
to me.
Now,
I know.
even then, did you have, and I do want to talk about your interesting position vis-a-vis feminism. It strikes me that you're always straddling worlds. On the one hand, you see things clearly. On the other hand, you sort of, it seems to me, as in Newsweek, you kind of found the difficulty of it or the ridiculousness of it a challenge or even a kind of fun. That's what comes through in your writing.
I don't think I thought of it as fun. I think I thought of it as the way it was, and that you were going to have to work around that. And when the women's movement sprang up, as it did, really not, in the early 70s,
Yeah.
and the women at Newsweek filed their lawsuit demanding that women be hired there as writers. I was totally in awe of them, because that, of course, is what we should have been doing 8 years earlier. But instead we just thought, okay, that's how it is. But I'm gonna work around that. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be a writer at Newsweek, but I might be a writer somewhere.
Aren't you lucky that you didn't stay as a writer?
Well, yes, I am,
Yeah.
actually. I'm very lucky. There are a whole bunch of things like that are very lucky. I tried to get a job at the New York Times at some point, and the Times wouldn't have me, and I'm very lucky I didn't go there.
Well, I was going to ask you about, after you were at Newsweek, you went to the Post, the New York Post.
Yes.
And
Not the current New York
it was
Post.
a different kind of Post.
Right.
And you went from there to Esquire and New York Magazine, very scrappy sort of upstart publications. And you write in your book that, you had the New Yorker over here, and then you had, New York magazine.
Yes.
And I wonder, I think about this because you said, well, you're glad you didn't stay at Newsweek as a writer. What if you'd gotten a job at the New Yorker?
As what?
As a writer.
That would have, I could have somehow lived with that.
You could, well, but
Yes.
you would have been a different writer. Your career
Maybe.
would have developed.
Yes, I feel very lucky because
Yeah.
I went to the New York Post, which thought if you were funny, they thought it was funny, and they let you write very. You had, to whatever extent I have a voice as a writer, it started at the Post, which was very welcoming to it. It was weird. It was a weird place because it had such a small staff, but it had more women on that staff than all other newspapers combined. They loved women, and they loved feature writing. That's what the New York Post was. It was an afternoon newspaper. It did not think that it had an obligation to give you the news as we understand the news, because it published all day long. The Post kind of assumed that its readers had already read one paper.
Did you know you were as funny as you were
No.
until then?
I wasn't.
Yeah.
I wasn't really.
You weren't funny? You found
No,
your
I think I
voice.
got funnier. I wasn't very good when I started, and but they really brought me along. They really trained me, and they couldn't have been, at one point they offered me a column at the New York Post. I was about 25. It was an unbelievable offer. And I said, well, I've never written a column. I'd never written anything like a column. They said, well, take a couple of weeks and write a couple of columns. So I still remember where I was sitting in the corner of the newsroom, because of course you could almost never get a desk at the New York Post, because you didn't have a desk, you didn't have a phone, you didn't have your own typewriter, you just sort of took what you could. And I sort of parked myself in the loneliest outpost of not a very big room, and struggled for days trying to write a column, and I couldn't do it. I didn't know how to do it. I mean, it's not, sometimes people think, sometimes I always feel bad with young writers who try to do something that's too hard for them at the beginning, and then they think they're no good at it. And when I started writing my column at Esquire when I was, 30 or something, that was about the first time I was ready to write essays. And I was not ready to write a whole lot of them. It was a monthly magazine. I only had to have one opinion a month, which was about right. And
you learned how to do it.
Yeah.
I want to talk about heartburn. This is my copy that I used. I told you before the interview that I've taught this book in a course, Jane Austen and Her Heirs, or Heiresses.
Oh, my God.
I love this book.
That, yeah.
I love this book. I think it's a comic masterpiece. I'll tell everybody that. I wonder, it is a work of fiction, but it's a roman à clef. It parallels your life at the time. It tells the story of the breakup of the marriage of Rachel Samstadt, I love that name, who is a cookbook author, 7 months pregnant, and discovers her husband, who's a journalist, is having an affair. And this is point by point, more or less, what happened to you in your marriage to Carl Bernstein.
With many embellishments.
With embellishments.
Yes, right.
It's a hilarious story. And I wonder, thinking back on it, how you feel. How do you feel about having written it? It took tremendous courage, it seems to me. Would you write it again?
No, it doesn't. I don't think it takes courage to write.
Why not?
Because it's what I do.
Yeah, everything's grist, right?
I write about, many writers, many novelists, and I do not count myself a novelist. I count myself as a person who once wrote a novel, a novel that is always described as thinly disguised, but nonetheless a novel.
It is definitely a novel.
And, I just think that when a story happens to you and you're a writer, you are someday going to find a way to write about that story. It was absolutely clear to me that a story had happened to me, and I hoped that someday I could make it into a funny story. I knew when it was happening that there were elements of it that someday might be funny, might be hilarious, but at the time I didn't think that they were.
Well, of course, it launched you in a sense. Would you say that this book really
Launched me?
Well, I don't know if that you were launched already,
Yeah.
but it gave you another level of visibility.
I don't know. It certainly made me. It certainly
Notorious.
Yes, it was something. It was definitely something in my career. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it also contains recipes. I still use the vinaigrette recipe in here.
It's really good.
It's
isn't
really
it?
good.
I know.
It
I'm
always
really
works.
Proud of that.
So it's about food too, and food is a motif in your writing. And of course, you wrote the screenplay and directed Julie and Julia. You say that in the 1970s you cooked you made all the recipes in Julia Child.
1960s.
In the 60s.
In the 60s, you had to cook all well, not everything in Julia Child.
Yeah.
Not at all everything, but quite a. It was a rite of passage. When you came to New York, you had to read Catch-22. You had to read Confessions of a Spent Youth by Vance Borgelli. You had to know who Murray Kempton was, and you had to have the Julia Child cookbook and the Michael Field cookbook and the New York Times cookbook, and you had to cook from all of them, and you had to have people to dinner and produce three-course meals.
Oh, God, I'm glad I
Yes.
wasn't there. To move out of this food area, your last collection, the one that you've just published, I Remember Nothing, has as a dominant motif, as did your previous collection, I Feel Bad About My Neck. The motif of aging is very much there in these two books. And you seem to be a spokeswoman for a large demographic now. Do you think of yourself that way? I mean, I'm sure you get loads of email and mail about how you speak for women.
Well, I don't know that, but I do know that when I got to be older, when I suddenly thought, I guess I'm now older, there was almost nothing published, written or published, that made any sense to me. There was a huge pile of books about how fabulous it was to be older and how you were in your happy golden years, and the joy of menopause and things like that, which I just thought, this is ridiculous. Can anyone tell the truth about this stuff? And by the way, when I wrote I Feel Bad About My Neck, one of the people at my otherwise excellent publishing house said, you can't call the book that because it's too negative. And I said, no, it's funny. It's funny. Trust me, it's funny. People will say, yes, I feel bad about my neck. They will. Trust me. And they did. But the point is that
no one had ever done it.
Nobody had done it, and nobody had said it because they were all so busy thinking that, I don't know what they were thinking, honestly. Sometimes I think it was just some way of selling a book or something. But I did think that I do think that I'm trying to write about getting older in a way that is somewhat honest, because the truth is, as Woody Allen, not to keep referring to him, but he does have a
crop
way
up.
I mean, it sucks.
Yeah.
It's very hard to think of anything about it that's better.
Well, you're talking about memory and aging and all of this. And in this book, of course, you deal with this fact that you don't remember a lot of things. But there's one little passage.
Or that I remember the most completely irrelevant things about some amazing things.
That happened to you.
Yes, I met Eleanor Roosevelt, and all I can remember are the drapes. That is really...
That's right. Well, this is the March on Washington. Read this. I mean, it's about Norman Mailer.
Oh, don't tell
Oh,
them.
okay.
We'll get to it.
Please.
We'll get to it. I marched on Washington to protest the war in Vietnam. This was in 1967, and it was the most significant event of the anti-war movement. Thousands and thousands of people were there. I went with a lawyer I was dating. We spent most of the day in a hotel room having sex. I am not proud of this, but I mention it because it explains why I honestly cannot remember anything about the protest, including whether I ever even got to the Pentagon. I don't think I did. I don't think I've ever been to the Pentagon, but I wouldn't bet a nickel on it one way or the other. Norman Mailer wrote an entire book about this march called The Armies of the Night. It was 288 pages long. It won the Pulitzer Prize, and I can barely write 2 paragraphs about it. If you knew Norman Mailer and me and were asked to guess which of us cared more about sex, you would, of course, pick Norman Mailer. How wrong you would be.
What I love about that is, I mean, the anecdote in itself, but the timing there.
Oh, thank you.
That's your comic gift. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Nora Ephron.
My pleasure.
And we'll be back.
Okay.
And thank you for joining us for the Drexel interview.